Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa nashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa nashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Allahumma la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una wanfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna 'ilma. Allahumma iftah ilayna hikmatak wa anshur 'alayna rahmatak ya dhal jalali wal ikram. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ونعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته and welcome everyone to our second session. Inshallah, what I want to do today before we go into actual study, which will start next week inshallah, is I wanted to talk about the modern and contemporary conception of psychology, which unfortunately many who are actually studying psychology, Muslims who are studying psychology, or they get into a career of life coaching or motivational speaking, unfortunately they are not aware of these things, and so they are essentially riding on the presented ideology behind the psychology of the West, and particularly the secular West. Now, that's not to say that anything that the West presents is as a blanket thing, bad or horrible. There's a lot that we can learn from other civilizations, but it is necessary to identify where the mistakes are made, because ultimately, you see, we say that practice makes perfect, but practice also tends to make permanent. And if you constantly practice the wrong things, if you're practicing a mistake or an error, that ultimately becomes, part of you. And a lie, often told so many times, will tend to start appearing as the truth. And that's essentially what's happening with contemporary psychology, because what's being presented from the other side is now starting to appear as though it's true. So Muslims are now riding on that bandwagon of contemporary psychology. And as we discussed in the group as well, with the question that was asked regarding, why do we call it Islamic psychology? This is essentially what ultimately transpires, because we then take what the other source gives as truth and then try to convert it into fitting the Islamic narrative, right? So I have a few bullet points that I'm going to go through today. You will find the comprehensive of these bullet points in my book, Understanding Ghazali's Alchemy of Happiness. And I'm writing a much more in-depth analysis of these and other aspects as well regarding contemporary psychology. It's not yet published, so inshallah when it is, we'll see how that goes. So the first thing that you tend to notice with contemporary psychology is that there is this hegemony of knowledge and information. And what's presented is that a subject like psychology can only be studied by someone who is academically proficient. It can only be studied institutionally. It can only be studied by select individuals who are either going to go into that profession or make a career out of that, that's going to be their job. That's essentially what the propagation is, the presentation of it is. And it's, like I said, it's driven from this ideology, the secular ideology of maintaining this hegemony of control over the flow of knowledge and information. And we would argue the contrary to that, because if we look at the Muslim civilization, knowledge was not the institution of select individuals of society. Everyone was privy and had access to learning. Now, undoubtedly, there are certain degrees of learning. So you can't, just the common layman, after reading a couple of books of psychology, doesn't become a psychiatrist who then, opens up a dispensary and starts treating patients. You see, just because you read a couple of books, it's the same thing with medicine, right? Just because you read a couple of books on cancer doesn't now qualify you to treat cancer, right? But that does not mean that the knowledge of it is restricted. Rather, it should be made commonly accessible, and accessible in a manner that allows the common man also to study and understand at least the basics of it, at least the fundamentals, the concepts of it, right? So this is our argument from the Muslim perspective, that something, I mean, other professions can be regarded in their own accord, right? Something like medicine, not everyone has a gift for that. You see, not everyone has the proficiency and capability of studying a subject like medicine. Not everyone can do accounting. Not everyone can be a lawyer or can understand jurisprudence. But the Muslim should at least have a basic understanding of all these fields. The West presents this as a sort of everyone has their own place, you see. So you've got your own place here, and if you need something that regards the law, you have to, pay this other individual over there to do it. You don't do it yourself, or you don't try and figure it out yourself. You see, so if you need your tire changed, you don't do it yourself. You call so and so, he will come with his truck and everything, and they'll fix it for you. So it sort of diminishes the intellective capability of a people because they are restricted to their own field of work or their career or a job. But something like psychology, and so that can be justifiable as far as that is concerned. You can't be a master of all. And here's the thing: there's this saying which says, "Jack of all trades, master of none." A lot of people quote that, but they don't quote the whole thing, right? It's Jack of all trades, master of none, but better than one. You see, so it's better for you to have a mastery of multiple disciplines, and these are how our scholars were nourished. You see, our civilization produced what we would call prolific scholars who are also polymaths, and they were able to master multiple disciplines. So you would find somebody who has an understanding of Islamic jurisprudence, but is also a doctor. You see, he knows healing, and he's also a master of astronomy and mathematics and geometry. And you would wonder, what does one have to do with the other? But they learn for the sake of learning, right? So insofar as the mundane aspects are concerned, yeah, you can justify that. But when it comes to knowledge of the human being, because you are the human being, right? I mean, what a shameful thing it is that you are the being, but you don't know about yourself, right? So this knowledge has to be accessible to everyone. It cannot be the enterprise of a select group of individuals, and then they maintain a hegemony and a monopoly over it. And they make it so difficult for people to actually learn it, so that they can then dictate the terms of it. They can then tell you, yeah, you see, you don't know about this, I know about this, this is what you need. You need to do what I tell you to do. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. The subject and the field of psychology, in my view, should not just be accessible to everyone. Islamically, it should be made mandatory for everyone to study, because you are the human being. You need to know about yourself. You need to know what are the things that drive you, what are the things that compel you, what are the things that are weaknesses in you, and how you can cultivate and build those weaknesses into strengths. You need to know your inner mechanism. You cannot just wait for somebody else to tell you, I think this is what's wrong with you. They can't see within you. They cannot run tests. They cannot put a scalpel and dissect within you and tell you, oh, you're suffering from depression. They can only look at the symptoms. It's you alone who can diagnose what is really wrong with you, and you need to understand how the system works within you so that you can diagnose it for yourself. You see? And then further to that, you have this other propagation that says that psychology only pertains, emotions and moods and feelings and these kind of things, which is completely false. Because in reality, moods and emotions and feelings are only externalities. They're only inhibitions. You see, it's what you feel. But then what brought about that feeling? You see, it's the emotion that came out. What drove that emotion? You see, psychology from the Islamic perspective does not pertain moods and feelings and emotions. Those are symptoms. Psychology from the Muslim perspective pertains intellection. It pertains the mind. It pertains your intellective capability and capacity. If you can nourish that, you will fix the moods and the emotions and the feelings automatically. Because rationality must sit in judgment over your emotions and feelings. Now, that's not to undermine emotions and feelings, but because this world that we're living in is a rational world. It's not an emotional world. You see, the things that don't interact via emotion, they interact via logic and rationality. And for you to survive in this world, you need to place rationality above your feelings, above your sense, above your emotions. And again, that's not to undermine sense and emotion and feelings, because there are many other instances now where emotions and feelings have to be given paramount importance. Because this world, as far as its rationality is concerned, is dictated by another world which doesn't function on rationality and doesn't function on logic. And many a times the sense and the emotion will override the rationality of a thing. The emotion that you will feel, the sense that you will feel, will override what you have rationally perceived of a thing. And this everyone can attest. If you've ever fallen in love, if you've ever had an attachment with somebody, a sentimental attachment with someone, with a loved one, with your parents or your siblings, or if you've ever had something of value, where the rationale of it will tell you this thing has got no value, but then the emotion of it gives it a much more transcendental value. So the emotion is important, but it needs to be cultivated and it needs to be regulated, because in the outward sense of this world, the emotion doesn't survive here. You see, it has to be handled. And this is why when we now talk about psychology, psychology is not about resolving the emotions, because you cannot resolve the emotions in this world. The emotions are resolved in the inner world, in the inside of you. And the way they will be resolved is by the power of intellection. So psychology pertains making sound the intellective capability of the individual. I don't want to disclose too much right now. I'd rather go through the text of Imam al-Ghazali and you will understand better what I'm talking about. But the West propagates it from this perspective. It's your feelings, it's your emotions, it's your likes and your dislikes. You see, your wants. So for them, from their perspective, for you to achieve internal soundness, you need to give your emotions, your self-esteem, your feelings, you need to give these things precedence. You need to do what you want to do. You see, this is part of their ideology. Do what thou will. You see, and that pertains the concupiscent and the irascible faculties of the self, because that's where the emotions eventually manifest, to bring out the desires, to bring out these wants of the world. But you're not here to fulfill desire, meaning you're not here to fulfill emotion. Emotion is part of you, you feel it, but you're not here to do that. You see, you're here to survive the rationality of this world and transcend it, so that you move from lust to love. And a love that's transcendental. It's not just hub, it's not just ishq. You see, it's mawadda, it's much more transcendental. It's an emotion of a much higher degree. Psychology does not deal with those things. And then this is where they eventually come around and say that psychology pertains behaviors and traits, which is now another gross misconception. Because behaviors and traits are symptoms. It's what you observe of something or someone, that they behave in a certain manner or they have a certain trait. Now, behaviors and traits, it's technical in the science as well. A behavior is something that someone does out of a circumstantial prompt. Something happened and then you behave in a certain way. It's not the norm of it. You see? So somebody can be doesn't really demonstrate anger that much, but then they can be put in a circumstance whereby that anger is prompted, and then you would say of that individual, he's behaving in a certain way. You see, he's behaving irrational. He's behaving like a maniac. But that's not the norm of it. A trait, on the other hand, is established as a norm of a thing. It's like the pattern. You see, that's how they've continually manifested that behavior in such a way that now it's normal to them. That's a trait. Both of these are external manifestations, or you would call them inhibitions. They are what are produced externally. but there is something else that has prompted that. And this is what Ghazali starts off by saying in the Kimya. The first section he talks about is he asks you the question, do you really know yourself? You see? Because where does this drive come from when you're prompted? When you feel angry, you want to argue, or when you're hungry, you want to eat. Where does this come from? If you don't know that, then you don't really know yourself. So your ilm al-nafs is deficient, because your ilm al-nafs, which is psychology, was only looking at the manifestations, the effects. There's something much more deeper than that. And largely this originates from the Western world, because what they did was to separate the sciences. They parted the sciences and made them as faculties of their own, essentially showing that there is no interconnectivity between one science and another. And if you remember when we talked about the 10 principles, Mabadi Ashira, of the sciences in Islam, that's not the case, you see, because one of the principles is, what does that science have to do with other sciences? What are the correlations, right? And in the past, inshallah, we'll talk about this as a history. We'll just do a brief history next session, inshallah, about where psychology, as a science, originated from and how it took its form. But in its origination, it was studied under philosophy. And this is something that people have completely forgotten, and those who are opposed to philosophy are, they just wipe it clean completely. They just don't even think about that. They just ignore a tangible reality, a tangible fact, that psychology originated from a branch of philosophy called philosophy of mind. And it has always been part of that. This is what Ghazali did. When he wrote his Maqasid al-Falasifa and the Hafat al-Falasifa, he essentially parted psychology into two things, philosophy into two things. He put the essential philosophy, which is the praiseworthy one, in one aspect, and then he removed the other aspect of philosophy, which was the subjective philosophy, which was the thing that involved a lot of speculations and assumptions. And when he separated that, if you look, when we go through the Kimya as-Sa'ada, he actually speaks philosophically, because that's where psychology originates from. It's studied as part of philosophy of mind, because as we said, psychology doesn't deal with behaviors and traits, it deals with intellection, it deals with the mind. And the mind is a faculty of thought, of ideas, of these rational reconciliations that take place within the human being to allow the human being to prompt certain action. You see? And that's what philosophy of mind does. Because along with that, you also have ethics and morals, and you've got all these other things that are peripheral to the soundness of the human being. You've got all these external philosophies as well. I mean, the ethics and morals, these can be inhibited internally, but then you've got all these external philosophies and ideologies as well that influence and affect the mental capabilities of an individual in a certain way. And unfortunately, the Muslim world has really lacked in this aspect, particularly with this propagation that, philosophy is haram. You'll see this, you'll open any of these books that come out from that part of the world. Philosophy, haram. Logic, haram. Haram. And then these same fools are there. You can see their inhibitions. They're following whose philosophies now? The philosophies of the West. And we said last week that if you don't learn to philosophize, someone else is going to philosophize for you. And that's the case. This is what you can see manifesting in that part of the world. I don't want to mention names and blame people, but this is a truth of it. You see, there's a certain aspect of understanding a science and what aspects of the science are praiseworthy and blameworthy, and it takes true scholarship to be able to distinguish them, which is what Ghazali did. And unfortunately, these people do not even want to make an effort to doing that. So now you've got a psychology that's even taught in Muslim universities called Islamic psychology. And this is why we said I have a problem with that word, Islamic, because it is not Islamic psychology. It has just been Islamicized from the West, because it's not studied under the thought process that a Muslim would have. It's studied under the thought processes that a disbeliever would have. And that disbeliever doesn't recognize the validity of a soul. They don't acknowledge its reality. They don't acknowledge the reality of the spirit. They don't acknowledge that there are other influences that come into the human being that are unseen. To them, the world and reality is all causes and effects. You see? But it's not causes and effects in reality. There are conditions, there are variables, there are unseen imprints that we don't even know of. There are some that we can come to know of, but many of them we don't know of. And they just don't acknowledge it completely. And then we take that and adapt it into our framework. And most of these people, they don't even understand what the nafs is. You'll see them in their writings, a lot of their books. I've read some of them. They cannot distinguish between nafs and ruh, or aql and ruh, or qalb and nafs. They cannot distinguish the faculties themselves. How do you expect them to give you an understanding of how the faculties work? Psychology has everything to do with philosophy. And somebody who does, if you have a psychologist who doesn't at least, you don't have to be a master or a PhD in philosophy to study psychology, but you should at least study these things. Morals and ethics and variant ideologies, how are they formulated? How are they impacted? How do they influence others? You need to have a working knowledge of this. Because if you don't have that and you call yourself a psychologist, I'm sorry. Whatever you got that degree, just give it back. Wallahi, just give it back. It's not worth anything. It's not even worth the paper it has been printed on. Because you are going to ruin people's lives instead of helping people. If you don't understand how the human being formulates his thoughts, how those thoughts are ratified within him, what the process is, what's epistemology, what's the process of epistemology? Because epistemology is at the root. We say that psychology has to do with intellection. And the most agitated aspect of the human being is a state of not knowing. It's an epistemological crisis, and you don't even know what epistemology means. You're not a psychologist. Anyway, I'm sorry, this is why I mentioned in the beginning that I'm going to be very critical, so please don't take my words to offense. They are meant to assist and aid. They are not meant to, darken or insult or offend anyone. So please do forgive me on that. And this also now leads to another propagation from the West. Not only is psychology for them not have nothing to do with philosophy, but then now psychology has nothing to do with religion. And this is what you call secularization, secularism. That psychology has nothing to do with religion, and they can prove it, quote unquote. They can prove it by giving you pills, by working out things that have got no religious affiliation. In fact, they will even encourage you not to get involved in religion. If you look at some of their articles, especially articles that are written with regards to crime, you will find that one of the leading causes that they list, the leading cause of crime, is religion. They put religion right at the top there. Wallahi. That religion is one of the prime causes of crime. Oh, look how people are just going and bombing themselves up, and that's according to them, because terrorism now is at the top, right? That's the worst thing you can be in this world. Murderer, adulterer, rapist, all that stuff. No, that's coming next, second. Terrorism is sin number one as far as the West is concerned. And especially if your name is Muhammad or Abdurrahman or something. We say that psychology has everything to do with religion. Because the psychological aspect of the human being, which is the soul, the central piece, has got an affiliation on one aspect with the body and the material realm, and then in the other aspect with the spirit and the spiritual realm. The soul is in the in-between of the ruh and the jism, the body. And so psychology has everything to do with religion, because religion, true religion, addresses all the four dimensions of the human being. The bodily dimension on the outward world, the inner dimension, which is part of, which pertains your faith, your iman, and then your inhibitions in this world, which pertain your ihsan. And lastly, your existential aspect of existing, your in existence, your being in time. Religion addresses all four, and this is why you find the soundest epistemology is the epistemology of Islam. And you find that the entire blueprint is summarized in one event, which is recorded in the books of Hadith as Hadith of Jibril. That is the epistemology of Islam. And you've got four dimensions. Islam, which pertains the outward, Iman, which pertains the inward, and Ihsan, which combines the two, merges the two together, the outward inhibition and the inward inhibition. And then you have a higher level, which is regarding your being in time. And it is signified in the Hadith of Jibril with as-sa'a, the last hour. Because the human history is ending now with the last hour. It began, it's gone through, and this is the human being's journey through life. It ends with the hour. You are a being in time, right? We don't have, this is not our discussion, but inshallah when we do a course on epistemology, we'll definitely be looking into that hadith in more depth. But the spiritual aspect is what we would say determines the material aspect. It is the malakut which gives rise to the mulk. It is the amr that gives rise to the khalq. And the khalq is the outward. The amr is the inward. Your thoughts, your emotions, your intentions, your intellections, all those aspects, your will, your consciousness, your heart, even your soul in one aspect of its dimension, they all belong to alam al-amr. We're going to talk about, I'll explain in detail now these different realms. They come from the malakut, and that's what gives rise to the mulk. The mulk, this is the outward aspect of reality. This is the mulk. This body is the mulk, you see? And the soul is the in-between. And religion pertains a spiritual doctrine. It doesn't only pertain a material doctrine. And unfortunately, this is their perception of what religion is. They're only looking at the outward. They're looking at a nominal religion. You see, they're looking and seeing, oh, okay, look, this, so Tablighi Jamaat, they do ABCD. Okay, Salafi do ABCD. Oh, okay, so-and-so do this. Oh, okay, look at the Sufi, they do like, they look at the outward. But all these individuals have in common a normative religion. What is normative to the religion? And this is what it is. It's not just the outward, because the outward is just one dimension. The other three pertain the inward, which is from a spiritual dimension. And they are all collected within the human being. They're part and parcel of your psychology. And so psychology has everything to do with religion. You cannot, let me underline this, you cannot treat psychology without religion. You can only cure, or not even cure, you can only still the symptoms. You will only mask the symptoms, mask the problem. You can work out just the general outward aspect of it. Somebody is feeling down, okay, you know what, go outside, maybe have some fresh air for 15 minutes a day as therapy. Yeah, it will still it, but the actual anguish, the deep anguish, deep-rooted within you can only be resolved by religion and no other, because it is God Almighty who has created the human being, and it is God Almighty who has set the ordinance of normal functionality for the human being. There is no other set formula you can follow except His ordainment. So you have to do it religiously. There's no other alternative, you see. And I mean, this is where now, you see, ultimately you examine and you ask yourself, okay, what's the ultimate nth of the human being? Because we're all seeking something, right? For psychological soundness, what is it that we're actually looking for? And we come to the conclusion that we're looking for happiness. We're looking for joy. We're looking for some contentment. That's essentially what we're doing. So happiness is really the nth of it. But then how is that happiness then achieved? How is it arrived at? Because if you look at the secular definition of what happiness is, they will say, and you can Google this if you want. You can Google and look at all the different articles and everything, all the different things posted. That the happiness is a state of emotional well-being. You see, this goes back to the previous point I made, where psychology has to do with emotions, has to do with feelings. So according to them, happiness has to do with emotional well-being. We argue that happiness doesn't pertain emotional well-being. It will manifest in emotion, but it doesn't originate from emotion. It has to do with intellection. Happiness has to do with sound intellection internally. When you are able to understand things, rationalize things, when you have got circumstances and you're able to deal with them, solve the issues that you're working through, that's when you will experience true happiness. It doesn't have to do with the emotional state. It has to do with your mental state. So psychology has to do with the mental state insofar as your seeking of happiness is concerned, because that's primarily what the human being is looking for. That's it. That's the end of whatever it is you're looking for, whatever you're searching for in life. All your goals, all your ambitions ultimately funnel down to a single ambition, a single goal, a single purpose, and that's to seek out contentment, to seek out happiness. And it's got nothing to do with emotion. Emotion is just the feeling of it. It's what's manifested in it. It's the intellection that allows you to experience that happiness. And this is why we say psychology has to do with intellection. It has to do with soundness of a resolution, an epistemological resolution within the self, within the soul, so that all the components that are arranged in you are functioning in harmony and are functioning in recognition, understanding, and realization of divine ordinance. Anything other than that would now be considered an abnormality. This is what now the other propagation that comes from the West, as they try to define what is normal and what is abnormal. Because to them, normalcy is defined by what is societally deduced or communally established. Once they've established themselves as the puppeteers, you see, they have a monopoly and a hegemony of the knowledge itself and the flow of information. Now they can dictate the terms of what constitutes as normal and what constitutes as abnormal. So that any ideology that is proposed by them, if you do not accept that ideology, you are considered to be abnormal. You're considered to be out of bounds. There's something wrong with you. You see, you're homophobic. Why can't you accept gay people? There's something wrong with you. In Islam, psychological normalcy is not established at the mundane level. Humans do not decide what is normal. God decides what is normal. He's the one who created the world. He's the one who set the rules of functionality. And He created you and put you in this world. He has also set the rules of your functionality. If you function within those rules, then you would be said to be normal. If you're going to function outside those rules, then you can be guaranteed to be said to be abnormal. This is why the atheists, the secularists, these are the most abnormal people in the world. Their disorders are the worst disorders in the world, because they are in obstinate defiance of God Himself. Normalcy is in acceptance of God as the supreme authority. When the human being submits to the Lord Almighty and accepts Him as his guide and his sustainer, that is what we would call normal. So whatever psychology they are pursuing, as far as this is normal. Now we're not talking about disorders, we're not talking about inhibitions, illnesses, we're not talking about those. You see, complexities. And by the way, as far as those are concerned, complexities, disorders, compulsions, everyone has that. Every human being has got a complexity, at the very least one, has got a disorder, at least one, and has compulsions. It's just the amount of tolerance that the soul has got insofar as those complexities and disorders and compulsions go, and obsessions go. You see, everyone has anxiety, everyone has depression, everyone has even ADHD as far as those are concerned. Everyone is autistic in one aspect or another. You see, everyone has got these desynchronicities insofar as the logical functions of the world are concerned. But it is how well the soul is able to intellect to maintain a tolerance. Because you have to remember that the soul is an alien to this world. The ruh is an alien to this world. The human being is alien to this world. The origination of the human being is from a spiritual realm. And so in this world, it is alienated. And it is prone to be disoriented by that. You see this in children, in infants, when they have just come into this world. They are crying and they are miserable, and because of they are alienated to this world, it is disorienting them. The light coming through the senses, all the sounds that they're hearing, it takes a long time for them to adjust until they're able to say, okay, they're able to tolerate that. They're able to tolerate the light. They're able to tolerate the noise. They're able to tolerate all this, the gravity and the falling down and the hurt and the pain and all these things. You see, and there are certain parameters of tolerance that every human being has got. And some people will shift a little bit to one side and shift a little bit to the other side. Other people will resonate between these. But there is a threshold after which, when an individual crosses that threshold of a compulsion or a disorder, it becomes irreversible. That ultimately would manifest as an illness. But we all have this. It's all there. It's part of us. You see. But that's not what we're talking about insofar as normalcy is concerned. Normalcy is whether or not the human being is existing in this realm insofar as the instructions of his existence are concerned. The designer of the human being, the one who made the human being, has put down certain rules and says that this object has to function within these rules. If these rules are breached, this object will get destroyed. You see? So normalcy is if the human being is working within the ordained parameters. And this is why the Creator is a guide. And what He has sent down is a guidance. And He's telling you in the Quran, you will find it in Surah Al-A'raf, when there comes guidance to you, Adam and Hawa, and your progeny and your descendants, whosoever follows that guidance will be sound. And whosoever does not follow that guidance will destroy themselves. I'm paraphrasing the ayah, but you'll find it in the surah. This is what now Islam, as far as psychology is concerned from the Islamic perspective, we look at it from this angle. That to heal a person, to heal an individual, you need to bring them into a functionality within these parameters of religion. Not within the parameters as dictated by whatever civilization that person might be in, wherever they might be, whether it is this new culture that comes in from it, or pop culture, or whatever other thing. So if you don't work within that, you're considered abnormal. Like someone like me, if I go back to the West now, in many of these circles, I would be considered an oddity. Because I would most likely just be quiet. I don't know what a lot of people are talking about. I don't even understand the language that they're using. So they'll think that I'm an introvert. I'm reserved. I'm socially awkward. This is how they'll perceive it. They'll perceive me as an abnormality. And yet I'm not abnormal. I'm normal. I'm speaking and, I'm sound, right? And this now leads me, inshallah, to the last point that I wanted to discuss. And this is the most important piece. And if you're a life coach, if you're a motivational speaker, and if you're a psychiatrist, psychologist, you need to understand this at the root level. If you are sincere and honest in helping your patients or your clients, in this case, I know most life coaches have clients. But if you're sincere in helping people, you need to understand this at the very fundamental level. Because from the West, it is presented that your existence in this world is to control your life. And so the structure of psychology and psychiatry that is presented is a control of life. They train you to try and control your life. And this is a fallacy, the biggest fallacy a human being can make. Because life is not yours to control. It doesn't belong to you. You did not give yourself life. Life is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He controls life. You don't control life. Because you don't know what's going to unfold next. You don't know what the next moment is going to bring. You don't have a full measure of how long the life is to be able to control it. For you to have power over a thing, you need to have a complete measurement over the thing. You need to know all its dimensions. You need to know everything about it. And for you, in that regard, for you to have control over life, you need to know how long life is. You need to know everything that is going to happen in that life for you to be able to control it. These people, the way they present this, they're not talking about life. They're just talking about the circumstances of life. Yeah, if you control the circumstance, then you can have some measure of control. And the human being has been granted this ability to estimate, to have some sort of an estimation or some sort of anticipation, so that he is not entirely lost. He has some measure of control. So you have been given some measure of control insofar as your circumstances are concerned, not insofar as your life is concerned. You cannot control your life. You were not sent into this world to control your life. You were sent into this world to correct your life. It is correction, not control. Psychology pertains correction of life, not control of life. Correct, the right application, the right study of this field and the right application of this field is to correct one's life, not to control it. It is to be able to examine an individual and to say, look, this your inhibition of your anxiety is due to A, B, C, D. These things in your life that are taking place. You need to rectify these. You need to allow your mind to follow divine ordinance in order to rectify yourself here. You see, in the past, in our tradition, psychologists did not only treat orders and disorders and anxieties and all these. They also examined the spiritual state for those who are proficient enough to do, because that's a very high level in the field. It's a very high level ability to be able to examine somebody's spiritual state. But you have psychologists in our tradition who examine the spiritual state of the individual and say that you are having this and this issue because you are a miser. Go and give sadaqah. And that person would be resolved. Their issue would be resolved just by opening that up. Just by realizing that this is what this is what I'm inhibiting internally, and so this is what's manifesting externally. If I can just rectify this, it rectifies everything else. Instead of you trying to control your life, rectify the negative and blameworthy aspects of your living. Don't try to control that which is not in your control. Psychology is not about control. Psychology is about correction and rectification. And inshallah ta'ala, this is what we want to arrive at the conclusion of our study in the next sessions. This is what you will find is in the texts of our scholars, particularly Ghazali's text, which we will be studying, and also conclusively from the other texts. Those who have been able to procure the book, The Sustenance of the Soul, you will find Abu Zayd al-Balqi actually pointing these out. He doesn't state it explicitly, but this is a concept. He points these out. Fix these things internally and you will rectify these other things externally. So inshallah, I think we are low on time. Okay, there's just one last thing I wanted to point out. I forgot to mention it. You have to understand that psychology is not just related to the psyche. This is again part of their separation or segregation of sciences. And they'll try and say, oh, psychology has nothing to do with physiology, or physiology has nothing to do with psychology. So you have all these doctors who will treat a patient as far as the body is concerned, but do not take into account the mental state of the patient. And you also have these psychiatrists who only look at, okay, this is what you're feeling and this is whatever, and they don't take into account what are the physical inhibitions of it. So some psychiatrists will just give pills or antidepressants or something like that, and they'll put the patient in some temporary state of euphoria. Okay, we fixed your depression, but then it will have another effect in the long run that will make the depression even worse, and they never take this into account. And the same case applies to physicians. You know, they'll handle and manhandle people in unimaginable ways, not taking into account what the psychological manifestations are, particularly with children. If you're especially in the West, if you over the recent years, if you delivered a child at the hospitals, you just examine that and you will attest to what I'm saying in the way they handle an infant child. All these syringes and injections and tossing the baby this way and tossing them that way. They don't understand that this aggression actually manifests into aggression in the soul, because that's what the soul is acquiring. It's absorbing this in the initial instant. In Islam, the children are never dealt with in that way. They're never handled that way, infants. This is why you give the child something sweet on the tongue, the first thing. And you do the adhan so that the soul not only remembers where it's come from, but it gets tranquility from that, so that can be the norm of it. But many of these infants, this is what ultimately manifests into these souls. And I mean, people will argue with me, but even things like autism and ADHD, I would argue the root causes are in the way these children are handled in the hospitals when they're born. For me, as far as I'm concerned, all these vaccinations that they give the children at this tender age of 3 months and 2 months and 6 months, poking with the needles and these external chemicals coming into the body, they don't understand that the soul is still finding its place within the body. It's still synchronizing with the body. It's not yet there, you see, it's not fully mature. And then you bring in an external substance that causes a desynchronization within the soul and the body, it is going to become permanent. A lot of children will develop a tolerance of it because every soul is different. Every body is also different. But for those who are not able to rectify that, to heal themselves, those bodies and those souls not able to heal themselves over time, will ultimately, it becomes permanent. And then you have children with all these different problems. And till today, they will still argue, we don't know where it's coming from. This is where it's coming from. Or we don't know what's causing autism. It's you who is causing autism. It's you who is causing ADHD. The way because the physiology of the human being is entwined with the psychology of the human being. Every body is uniquely designed for its soul. The body cannot be shared with another soul. And one soul cannot share another body. Each soul and each body is designed to merge together for its longevity in this world. So what happens insofar as the physiology is concerned will have an effect insofar as the psychology is concerned. And what happens psychologically will have an effect on the physiology. And you can see this is the first thing in Abu Zayd al-Balki's books, in the sustenance of the soul. It is the first thing he talks about. And this is why you find our scholars studied both. Our scholars studied both. They studied physiology and they studied psychology as well. So you'll find like Ibn Sina wrote the Qanun of medicine, the canon of medicine, but then he also wrote Kitab al-Shifa, which is a text on psychology. Abu Zayd al-Balki wrote a sustenance of the body and then sustenance of the soul. Imam al-Ghazali, the Kimya Asada, he's not speaking psychologically. He's approaching it more spiritual, because this is what he ended up doing, is taking psychology, place it back under philosophy, and then took philosophy and refined it, cleaned it out, and placed it under religion. So he approached the subject holistically from a religious perspective into a philosophical perspective into psychology. So, but as far as psychiatry and physiology is concerned, it has to go hand in hand. The doctor has to understand that he's not just there to treat the cough and the fever and the ache. There's something else also that he needs to take into account. And the psychiatrist also needs to understand that it's not just about the outward aspect that it's just not just go, okay, fine, I'm feeling down, or you know what, do this. It's not just that. He has to take into account other things, because much of the psychiatry today contemporarily involves these pills and injections and all these things. And it's very unfortunate, because it doesn't fix the problem. The anguish of the soul cannot be masked. It can't be hidden. It can't be brushed under the carpet. It has to be dealt with. And it could be that the externalities are causing the problem. And so the individual, the psychiatrist, needs to examine both. And likewise for the physician needs to examine both. They both go hand in hand, because Muslims, we believe that we are not dualists in that sense. These are not separate. Even though we study these entities separately, they are infused together. And you cannot just part them and treat this one separately and treat that one separately. You need to take both the account, because whatever manifests in the soul will manifest in the body. Whatever is inhibited in the body will manifest in the soul. And you can experiment this on yourself. If you think I'm invalid in my claim, you can experiment this on yourself. When you have a fever, you will find yourself, your thoughts are disoriented, your speech is disoriented. You'll see this. When you've got mental stress, and that's a sign of when the body is ill, the soul will have a certain manifestation. And the vice versa. When the soul is ill, like if you've got some sort of mental stress, you'll find that you don't have an appetite for food, maybe. You see, because then same is true. Whatever effect is having on the soul will also manifest on the body. So you need to take both into account, inshallah. Let's end here and maybe take a quick break, 5 minutes, and we'll resume for questions and answers and discussion and thoughts and comments, inshallah. Let's take a quick break. Jazakallah khairan. Alhamdulillah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Okay, now go ahead, inshallah. You have a question. Go ahead.
Did Brother Mujahid is first?
Yeah.
Mujahid, unmute your mic and go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me?
Alaikum salam. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, hope you're doing well, Ustad. I had 4 questions, but I'll ask one, and if I have time, I'll try and ask others, because they're not related to psychology directly.
That's fine, you can, inshallah. That's fine.
Okay, so I was looking at the verses in the Quran from Surah Al-Hijr. Should I mention the translation for the benefit of the audience?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so from verse 26 it says translation of the meaning, and we did certainly create man, and the word used is al-insan, out of clay from an altered black mud, and the jinn we created before from scorching fire. And mention, O Muhammad, when your Lord said to the angels, I will create a human being out of clay from an altered black mud, but here the word bashar is used. And when I have proportioned him and breathed into him my soul, or my creating soul, then fall down to him in prostration. And the verse continues. I just wanted to ask, what is the difference between the words in al-insan and bashar? I'm currently doing some research on, the early so-called human beings, Neanderthals, etc. Is there a relevance there between the humans, between the soul and these early humans?
Mm-hmm. These terms, these are actually terms of classification. So it classifies and this is actually under logic. You've got the genus, you've got the species, differentia, and all that. The 5 predicables, and then you've got the 10 that categorize the material form. The words like insan, bashar, ibn Adam, These are all, they are contextually applied in the Quran, but they all pertain the human being. So insan is like the species in this case, mankind. Insan would be like the genus, the comprehensive group. So you've got jinn as a comprehensive group, and then you've got hayawan as the comprehensive group, and you've got insan as the comprehensive group. And then bashar is like, comes in that. So instead of calling it humanity, you would call it man. Right? So man is like, it falls under that group. And then Ibn Adam is synonymous to insan, is synonymous to bashar as well, as the progeny of Adam being the prime origin of that species. As far as it regards previous species of similar nature, I mean, as where my knowledge goes with that, I'm not inclined towards believing that in any case. But insofar as the science of it goes, it can neither be affirmed nor negated per se. It is possible that there was another species prior to the human being insofar as the form is concerned, but not insofar as the species in particular is concerned. It's possible. I mean, I'm saying it's possible. I personally don't believe in the whole evolution of man from a different species coming into a different species. I don't believe in that at all, because the Quran is very explicit in that sense by saying that Adam was the first. So if Adam was the first, which one evolved into which one? You see, which ape evolved into Adam, and then from Adam we started having all of us. There are too many issues with that theory. It's possible that there was another species because it does not limit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His power of creation. It's possible that there were other species and they had their own categorization, and that mankind is essentially the best of that type, which you would call a humanoid species. But I've seen some books written on the subject as well by certain scholars who are sympathetic to the Darwinian evolutionary theory, which in any case, if you examine Darwinian evolution, if you examine the theory of Darwin himself, he does not actually acknowledge a previous species from which mankind was evolved. Darwin actually theorizes a controlled evolution, not a random selection based theory. That's not what his theory deals with. It's a controlled evolution, meaning that within a group of species, there is certain evolutions that can take place. So within the human species, you can see certain evolutions taking place, because when people move around, like migration, for example, is one factor. Somebody could be born, let's say originates from China, but then over a few hundred years, if that individual, they move and then their descendants move and they move and they move and they keep going, let's say they go all the way to Europe, they will no longer have this Chinese trait in them insofar as their body is concerned, because a certain evolution has taken place there. The environment has also caused that evolution to take place, but it's a controlled evolution. It's not just random. There was an intent behind it. There was intellection involved insofar as one person deciding to move and then the other person moving, and then some intertribal marriage or something, and then their children, they moved elsewhere. So there was some thought involved in that. It's not just random. It didn't just happen. That's unfortunately what the West has done, is to take a theory and then morphed it and changed it into something of their own notion to support whatever ideologies they have. And they do this with many scientists. I mean, like Einstein's theory of general relativity, they start talking about time travel and everything, and Einstein was not talking about that. Right? Even though he does give you the possibility or impossibility of it, that's not what the theory is about in any sense. Sorry, I'm going to ramble on this. But the terms that are used in the Quran, they are contextual in each ayah, and they have a certain meaning that's elaborated from that. So insan is like sort of the whole species, the species of mankind, you see. And then bashar is, bashar is more used more intimately. If instead of saying, that man or something, you would say that man instead of saying that mankind or something like that. It doesn't match, it doesn't gel in. Yeah, I hope I answered the question. What was your other
So,
question?
I just wanted to add this, the part of this, in the verse it mentions soul, ruh. Is that, I thought that was linked to Bashar, as in the Bashar has a soul, but the Insan may or may not have a soul. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Every creature has a soul. Every creature has a soul. Every creature in this dominion has got a soul. Plants have souls, animals have souls, insects have souls. Anything that has got some measure of recognition of reality or has got a measure of intellection, whether it's very subsistent like the vegetation. Vegetation doesn't have prime intellection, right? As far as vegetation is concerned, the intellection is algorithmic insofar as just bodily sustenance is concerned. Plants only intellect by these externalities that prompt them to react. So sunshine or water or nutrients. And they do have feelings, by the way. I mean, recent studies have also shown that plants do actually react to certain atmospheres, especially in the household. If it's a toxic household, plants will tend to die. They'll wither out, no matter how much water and nutrients you give them. You know, like you have like tree whisperers, for example. As many of the Aboriginal tribes were tree whisperers. They would speak to plants, and they would, there's this fable about a tribe in the Solomon Islands, I believe it's called, who when they want to cut down a tree, they don't just chop it off. The whole tribe gathers around the tree and insults it with the most vulgar words, and the tree just dies on its own. It's a story, it's just a fable, but it kind of gives you an idea that, it has a soul. So every creature has a soul. And every creature is enlivened with the spirit, with the ruh. It's called ruh al-hayawani. It's called the animus spirit. It's what gives it life. It's what makes the body come alive. And it's what they're trying to replicate. The secularists, they're trying to replicate that without bringing in, because this is where the Quran says to tell them, ar-ruhu min amri rabbi. The ruh is from the affair, is from the command of my Lord. No one can replicate it. Only He gives life by giving the body the ruh. Did I answer that? Did I answer your question?
Yes, Jazakallah. Yeah, there's a lot more to it. I appreciate that.
No. Go ahead. Do you want to ask your other questions, or you want to wait?
I'll give others opportunity.
Okay. Go ahead. Who is next? I see your hand up.
Hina seems to be on top.
Yeah.
Hina, unmute your mic, please, and ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
You told us about the difference between what the secular world teaches us and what we know Islamically. For example, when you said we are not here to fulfill the emotions, desires, and we are here to move to a higher state of being, right? So my question is related to the term that is used in the secular world, which is personality or individuality. Now, in the Muslims, amongst the Muslims, like we know, living in a Jama or thinking as a whole, as an ummah, and being under a leader. But we also know people like Sahabas, like Umar radiallahu anhu, was different from, say, Hazrat Usman or Hazrat Abu Bakr. So, where does this harmony, where can we reach an understanding of a balance between what is individuality, personality, and as a being as an ummati?
Okay, so personality is defined as a being's collection of behaviors and traits, a composition of your behaviors and traits. So each individual has certain behaviors and then has certain common traits. That collectively comes into being the individual's personality. It forms the personality of the individual. So, but individuality has to do with the self. And this is where the West doesn't give the truth as far as it's concerned. I don't think they know the truth, because there's a difference between soul and self. Personality and individuality pertain the self. They don't pertain the soul. the self is is the side that is linked to the bodily aspect. Inshallah, when we reach the section, I have some diagrams which I will share, and you will be able to better understand this dimensionality of the being internally. There's that one side which is outwardly connected to the body, and then there's the other side which is inwardly connected via the heart to the spirit. That's the soul. That's what you would call a soul, because it's an embodiment. And then the self is what appears on the outward. So when you look at somebody, you see their personality and then you see their individuality. That individuality is as a presentation of the self. It's not the identity per se, the true identity. What inhibits deep down inside, and this is where we're going to talk about this. I'm going to give you guys a different theory on this, and it pertains the levels of intelligence. There are different levels of intelligence that now determine what the ultimate inhibition would be and what really distinguishes people from other people. And in that, you've got the individual mind, and then you've got the collective mind. So the individual mind is the one person like myself. I think this and I think this, and I have a theory about this and I have a theory about that. Even so far as religious matters are concerned, there are certain things that I feel shouldn't be right, shouldn't be done. But then there's the collective mind, what you would call the jama'ah. So for example, I'm here in Turkey and my training in fiqh, particularly in salah, is different from what is practiced here in the jama'ah. But when I go to the masjid to pray my salah, I pray with the jama'ah. I do as the jama'ah does, as long as I have verified for myself that what the jama'ah is doing is not incorrect. It is correct as a school of thought, insofar as their school of thought is concerned. So likewise, if somebody is a Maliki, for example, goes to a masjid where it's predominantly Hanafi, then the Maliki, even though he prays, because Malikis pray with their hands on the side, but in the masjid, he can still pray with his hands on the side because it's not wrong, it's not incorrect, you see. So that's the individual now, that's the one individual. You have your own thoughts and compositions and everything, and then you've got the collective mind. And this is the directive from the Sunnah and from the religion, is to be with the collective, so long as the collective is correct, is right. If the collective is wrong, then you are under the obligation to leave the collective. But there is a degree of intellection that must take place. There's a certain level of intellection that you need to have to make that decision. And if you do not have that ability, it is better for you to adhere to the collective. Anyway, that's going more into fiqh. But insofar as the psychology is concerned, this is where the individual needs to enhance themselves internally with the right knowledge in order to understand what is it that the collective is doing. Because the collective hive mind could be going astray, and you can't just follow the jama'ah, right? You're in the West and everybody is going to a nightclub. You're not going to go to a nightclub, are you? That's where the difference between you as the individual and the collective really comes in. If you look at the particulars now, like Omar, Abu Bakr, Ali, they all have their own unique personalities and their identities or individualities, because each one of them has a different internal configuration. And when we talk about the concupiscent, the irascible, the intellective faculty, you'll understand it's not uniform. It's not the same for everyone. You see, some people have a stronger concupiscence, have a weaker irascible, and a weak intellective. Others have a strong intellective, weak irascible, weak concupiscence. Others have a strong concupiscence, strong irascible, but a weak intellective. Everyone is different. You see, only prophets, if you want to examine them, only prophets have an internal harmony between all three faculties. And like I mentioned, I'm going to talk about different levels of intelligence. The highest level of intelligence is the prophetic intelligence. So only at that high level of intelligence can somebody actually find this internal harmonization, but everyone is going to come out different. So if you want to look at Omar, for example, Omar had an irascible nature. He was temperamental. If you look at Ali, Ali had an intellective nature. He was very good in learning, and so Ali essentially becomes the first scholar of Islam, if not for other individuals like Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar. But Ali becomes the first scholar of Islam. Abu Bakr, on the other hand, had a balanced, irascible, and concupiscent, and so he was evened out. He was sound. Uthman had a different personality, and so he also had a different way of doing things. You see, so they had their own inhibitions, but if you want to collect them all together and analyze them as a group, you will find that they all they just don't all complement each other, but they also collectively they present a sound collective, because each one's strength fortifies the other's weakness. You understand? Am I making sense, or am I getting too complex? Because we're going to actually go through this step by step to understand how the irascible and or how these all work, and hopefully you will understand it better, inshallah.
Right. Disability.
Now, go ahead, Roshan. I see your hand. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Before I go into my question, I just want to just get clarification on the ruh and the nafs. As I understand it, the nafs is a self, and the ruh is our soul or spirit. And the nafs is zahir, and the soul and spirit is batin. Now, Allah SWT create each of us different. We have different languages, different colors, different characters and traits. Now, does the trait or character, are we born with that? Is that innate in us? Because when I look in my children, for example, I try to teach them, but eventually they have their own character, they have their own trait, and that's what they're all going with in their life, right? No matter how hard I try to, I have my own too. And usually my children either follow my character or my wife's character, right? So that's what I found. So it looks like they are born with it, like it's innate, their traits are innate. Now, behaviors are not innate. They are from outside. They get influence. Like we have peer pressure, for example, at school will impact their behaviors. Does the behaviors change their innate character and trait? That's my first question.
Oh, that is your first.
And the other one I think is related. The mind, the intellection, when an individual, the person has lost his mind, his intellection, he's out of control.
You can use the same ones again.
Kill that person.
You can use the same ones.
How do we, what's the solution when somebody has lost his intellection?
Okay, and for the second one, that's going to be a bit more complex. It's more on a higher level because we're talking about now treatment, right? But inshallah, we'll talk about identification, or at least diagnosis in this course, inshallah, when we come to the section on that. And as far as your first question, there's actually multiple questions in there. We're going to talk about the soul, we're going to talk about the spirit, we're going to talk about the self, inshallah. Most likely in the third or fourth session, inshallah, when we get to the text. I would rather the text give you this, and I'll elaborate it better in the context of the session. And I'll explain the different terms and the different components. And we're also actually going to do a session on children. We're going to do a session on children, and then on teenagers, and then we'll also do on adults. And we'll talk much more about children when we do the text on the lives of men by Imam Abdullah ibn al-Haddad. So we'll be touching on that as well. But just to give you a brief on that, the traits that you're talking about, they're not actually traits. They look like traits. They seem like traits. But what they are inhibition. See, the trait comes after because it's a symptom. It's an effect, right? That means there's a cause behind that. That cause is internal, and that cause is determined by the nature of the human being. So every human being is born, as the Prophet ﷺ said, on fitrah, right? There's a nature that every human being is born on. And then following that, you have the human being's internal composition will either be irascible or concupiscent or intellective, and it will be on different levels for each individual. Each of those three components will have different either magnifications or they will be diminished at different levels. And the collection of that, because it's an equation, the external manifestation is an equation of concupiscent plus irascible plus intellection equals to the behaviors and traits. I'll put this equation down for you, inshallah. The irascible plus concupiscent plus intellection is equal to behaviors and traits. So what you're seeing is the final inhibition, but it's driven by a certain nature. So some children have more of the concupiscent and less of the irascible. Some have more of the irascible and more of the concupiscent. Children in general do not have intellection at the early stages of life, especially 1 to 3 years old. Around the age of 2.5 to 3 is when they start developing some sort of intellection. But at that early age, they don't have that. They're only inhibiting these two. So like my own personal example, my daughter had an irascible nature when she was young. And then my second son, my elder son, he had a lower irascible nature. And then my youngest son has an overly inflated, my wife is laughing at me, an overly inflated irascible nature. So each of these three, if I examine them, they all have different traits because of their inherent natures. We're talking about fitrah here. We're talking about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen to compose each individual soul. Because He says, وَالنَّفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا, that sawaha proportioning is not uniform. There is no uniformity insofar as Allah's creation is concerned. This is the alam, and the alam is diverse. It's diverse. The aspect of uniformity comes from the West. The concept of uniformity comes from the secular world. They want to make everything the same. But that's not how Allah's creation is, and everyone has a different balance internally. And this is why everyone will then demonstrate, as they're growing, as the children are growing, you will start to see certain inhibitions. Now, the fact that you're seeing, one child will sort of demonstrate qualities that your wife has, and then the other child will demonstrate qualities that you have, it's because of how they're absorbing it. And what is their relation, you see? Daughters will typically adapt to their mother's lifestyle. So children are absorbing. As their intellection is growing, they just absorb. They don't learn. Children don't learn, they acquire, they absorb, right? So they will observe and they will absorb from whichever parent they are closely attached to. And they will inhibit those qualities depending on what the irascible is, what the concupiscent is, what's the balance there. They will adapt accordingly. So you're seeing the manifestations, you're seeing the symptoms, right? Now, inshallah, when we go through this course, you will begin to understand what is it that prompts those manifestations, so that everyone, not just you, everyone who has children or who interacts with children, you will better understand how to raise your children, how to deal with them. And then teenagers, ultimately, inshallah ta'ala. Go ahead, Abu Talha. Sorry, Roshan, I hope I answered your question. We'll talk more about the intellection and how to deal with somebody who seems like they've lost their mind or something. Very briefly, but this is we're not going to be doing treatment in this course. That's a bit more advanced. Yeah, inshallah. Go ahead, Abu Talha.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. This is my
Alaikum
first
salam.
time start here.
Alaikum salam.
And my question probably might deviate a little bit, but it's just based on the research that I've been doing since a few years now. So talking about intelligence and talking about different traits and qualities that every human being is born with, right? When I was studying more about Judaism and the mysticism part of the Judaism, I came across, I read a few books by a few rabbis, well-known rabbis, and eventually what they do is, it all comes back to one thing, and that is using or activating or triggering your pineal gland in one way or another. And if you see the conspiracy theories, I've lived in America for a few years. I came back to India now, but that's where I came across with these conspiracy theories that the government flushes tons and tons of fluoride so that it's going to block it, calcify it. I don't know if that is true or not, but what is true is what these rabbis are writing. I mean, not true in exactly what they mean, but it's in textual format. So what I'm trying to question here is, what is the significance of this gland when it comes to an Islamic perspective? Does Islam talk about anything about this gland? Does it have anything to do with accessing the three parts of the brain simultaneously at the same time, the conscious, unconscious, and the subconscious? Or does it have any other thing, pertaining to seeing what is in the other realm, contacting the other entities? Could it be Jannat, Shayateen, learning from them? I don't know. It's a huge, I don't want to put in a lot of emphasis on this question, but I'm just picking the terms that I have read so that people who have an idea about it can relate to this question.
Okay. Actually, I'm glad you brought that question up. And inshallah, I'll expand more on it. We'll come to another section when Ghazali talks about the mind, the aql. But to give you in a nutshell, I'm sorry to say, but it's all hogwash. I've looked at those things. I looked at some of those propagations. It's all hogwash. It's very convoluted with a lot of conspiracy theories, and there's absolutely no true reality to it, even so far as the science is concerned, and there's no true reality to it insofar as spirituality is concerned, insofar as Islam is concerned. Because the mind, the aql, is not the brain. The two are not the same. The two are different. So as far as whatever faculty of the brain is concerned, whether it's the frontal lobe, the neocortex, or the pineal gland, or any of those aspects, these are all faculties that the mind will use, but not necessarily where you will find the mind. I see, because a lot of them, like you use the terms conscious, subconscious, unconscious, these have got nothing to do with the brain. These are all states of the mind. And we'll talk about the soul and the states of existence, the states of being, because the being has a state. There are wakeful status, sleep state, conscious state, unconscious state. These are all states that the soul is in. It's got nothing to do with the brain. Has got no relation there. The brain is just like a device. You see, it's like your computer. You've got a computer, and there's input of information and there's processing of information. Whatever you input into that machine, that's what it will compute. It doesn't open up all these new realities for you, and you're able to communicate with the jinn and learn new knowledges and this, that, and the other. I mean, you can see from the very sources that it originates from are from these Jewish sources, which, by the way, falls under the Jewish mysticism, and its compendium is essentially the book called the Kabbalah. And these are complete phantasms. They've got no basis in Islam, and they've got no hard truth in as far as science itself is concerned. True science, I'm talking about secular science, I'm talking about actual science in Islam and religion is concerned. Because, and you will understand, inshallah, when we go through this course, you will really get, inshallah, I'm hoping everyone is going to get a firm grasping of how the human being functions internally. What do each of these faculties and how do they relate with each other? The conspiracies can go on endlessly. I mean, I can come up with a conspiracy tomorrow and say consciousness is in my toe, and I can give a whole argument as far as how I can prove that. It doesn't make it true. You know, I've seen some of these conspiracies talking about the Eye of Horus and how the Egyptians knew that the pineal gland was the third window to the other gateway or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen all that stuff. To be honest with you, even the arguments themselves, if you just look at the arguments themselves, they don't even pass fundamental logic. The fundamental principles of logic, they don't even pass that test. Forget having to now examine them on higher levels and then validating them with the Quran. And this is what a lot of these people do. Muslims who are in this field of doing all that, they'll go straight to the Quran. They don't even understand the language of the Quran. They'll look at English translations and then, you know, use synonymic words just to morph and change it to fit the narrative and say, oh, look, this is what the Quran is also saying. That's how the devil works, you know. Shakespeare said about the devil, thus do I clothe my naked villainy, thus do I clothe my naked villainy with the holy writ, so I can appear most the devil, so I can appear a saint when I'm playing most the devil. This is what they do. They will take that and then manipulate it and change it, you know, and then dress it up and then present it as truth when it's not the truth. It's just naked villainy. This is just shrouding it. It's shrouding falsehood. And, you know, Muslims need to be careful when they start getting into these things, especially conspiracy theories. Just conspiracy theory is not a field of knowledge. It's a field of information. You'll get a lot of information there. And by the way, I'm not mocking or anything. There's some information you'll get there that is helpful. It's useful information, but it's not a source of knowledge. You cannot use that as a source of knowledge because conspiracies have to do with the mundane world. A conspiracy is limited to the political realm because only human beings come up with conspiracies. You don't hear about the rats conspiring against the mice or cats. You don't hear about, you know, the ants conspiring against the wasps. Animals and plants and all these others, they don't do conspiracies. It's a human thing. And so it's on this level of mundane affairs. It's not on a transcendental level. And inshallah, I'm going to talk about agent intellection, active intellection, spiritual intellection, and prophetic intellection. I mentioned that a bit earlier. You see, most of them are on this basic level of agent intellection. But the Quran is way up there. You cannot expect to reach there if you're going to be stuck here with conspiracy theories. It's not a source of knowledge. This is why a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, are going astray. I'm sorry to say, with all your flat earth theories and your pineal gland theories and I don't know what other stuff that you come up with, and you take that as truth, and worse yet, you take the Quran and you try to validate that truth. Subhanallah, you need to be careful. Study the science properly. At least do that first. Study all the requisite knowledges first. Get a firm understanding before you can venture into the unknown. Min al-ma'loom ila al-majhul. You need to move from the known into the unknown. You cannot just grasp into speculation and then take that as truth. It will lead you astray. It will lead you astray. I'm sorry, I didn't want to go off on a rant on that. But inshallah, I'm going to talk about this a little bit further and you'll understand how the mind, how the aql integrates with the brain and how it uses the brain. Ghazali is going to talk, he actually dedicated a section to that. And this is not a new argument, by the way. These are all arguments. And like you can see some of these depictions in Egyptian mythology and stuff. These are old arguments. And the philosophers at his age, they were arguing similar things. And they were wrong. And Ghazali disproves them. Many of the points that they make with regards to how the soul and the body and the ruh, how they function together, a lot of these mistakes, he actually disproves many of them. And he goes into much more detail in the Ihya Ulumuddin. Anyway, Jazakallah. Sorry, I didn't want to go off on a rant. But we'll talk about more of this, inshallah, in a later session.
Ustad, I have a follow-up question. I'm so sorry. If you permit me, I can ask it.
Go ahead.
So, when you said that, you know, all of this comes under the Jewish mysticism, it relates to Kabbalah, which is numerology and astrology and all that stuff kind of mixed up together. So do you think this is the knowledge of sihr that Allah has sent, which he talks about in Surah Baqarah?
The knowledge of
Babylon, because Kabbalah seems to be coming out from Babylon if you look at the history, and also Jews believe in it. So is that the same knowledge of sihr, which modern day Kabbalah is?
the knowledge.
Or is it different?
the knowledge, you need to understand, the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down is not particular knowledge. It doesn't deal with particularities. The knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down is a universal knowledge, is absolute truth. What's derived from that is now a human deed. The human being will look at it and derive certain understandings. So I'm giving you this as like a condensed version. What you find in the Kabbalah is not the original sense of witchcraft or sorcery that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in Surah Al-Baqarah with regards to Harut and Marut, and we're going off on a different subject. But that was a sort of a universal aspect of witchcraft. You see, if you bend the rules here and there, then you will get A, B, C, D results from that. And then what subsequent generations would do with that is expand on that knowledge. They'll go further and further and deeper into it and build a sort of science out of it. That's what the Kabbalah is. It is a textbook on the science of sorcery. Essentially, that's what it is. But it's not the actual thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down. No. I don't want to speak too much on that subject because some people actually get nightmares and it's not really the topic of our discussion. Go ahead, there's another question. Okay, we'll have to move fast because I can hear the adhan for Maghrib for me. So real quick, 5 more minutes. I can dedicate 5 more minutes. Yeah, 5. Okay, 2. I'm told 2 minutes. I'm told 2 minutes. If your question is long, inshallah, just hold on to it and we can maybe address it in the next session.
Can I ask you a quick question then? Will we be speaking about jinn possession and waswas of jinn in sports?
Very, very briefly. It's not really the core of our discussion, but very briefly. I will touch on it a little bit, inshallah. Last question. Go ahead. Is it Haja?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Alhamdulillah. Ustad, I am studying also the first course, Fundamentals of Arabic and Sciences, and I'm truly learning and enjoying it. My question is, you spoke about how we use Islamic psychology as what this study is, and I do think that it's not representing what we're meaning. So what would be the correct expression to say this study using the Arabic versus taking everything from English and translate? I'm trying to learn how to get away from that and using the Arabic for truly what I'm meaning versus, because that is in the way.
Okay.
In the way.
Okay. So basically, Go ahead. Sorry.
So if someone says, I'm referencing this when I'm learning, and then what is that you're talking about? I don't want to say Islamic psychology. What would be the entitlement just to cover the whole content of what this is about versus saying Islamic psychology? Is there another way to express this?
Well, the only true term that you would apply, because the science itself is called ilmun nafs. That's what it is, ilmun nafs. And its direct translation is psychology. So the only thing is that we're adding Islamic there to distinguish that psychology from true psychology. And it's a problem because we're using their language. It's the English language we're using. But if you study this in a Muslim university, you'll be studying ilmun nafs. You won't be studying Islamic psychology. You'll just study ilmun nafs. So you essentially, our study is with regards to the soul. We're studying the soul. Yeah.
Okay, so that just saying that helps me to bring it back to the soul again. I'm bringing the soul back to it. Thank you for that. Also, you referenced books. Could you give me the title of the books we can be reading also along with our studies?
I'm going to go through 3 primary texts. The one is going to be Imam al-Ghazali's Kimya as-Sa'ada, which is the main text. And then I'm going to touch on another book by Abu Zayd al-Balqi, and it's titled The Sustenance of the Soul. You can get the book. It's been translated by Dr. Malik Badri. It's in English. You can get that. And the third that I will go through is titled The Lives of Man by Imam Abdullah ibn al-Haddad. And I believe somebody shared somebody found the PDFs on the thing, on the group, and they shared it. So you'll probably find the links there as well. And the text that we'll be using here is my own translation. You will also get the PDF for that if you're in the group. You'll be able to download those, inshallah. And any other books that I come across along the way, I'll make mention of them.
Okay, so the PDFs are available now. I can just go through the text on the Telegram.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Okay. And any other question? Last question? I saw somebody's hand up. Whose hand was up? Yes, Mujahid, go ahead. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. So you touched on epistemology. So in Hadith Jibreel, there's Islam, Iman, and Ihsan in the pattern, in the form of If'al. Is there a similar word in that pattern, in that form for the last topic, which is Asa?
There isn't, because that last piece there, the last section, and this goes, if we were to actually study the hadith, we would go deeper into it. That last piece is left vague. And it's left vague because it includes the entirety of the being's existence. It's much more profound. There's no one set science that can be applied to that. And this is really the main goal of philosophers, to try and understand this aspect, because it pertains two things. It pertains a human identity and human destiny. Who am I and where am I headed, right? So from the destiny aspect, one of the sciences, not the science, one of the sciences is eschatology, because it deals with the finality of it, the destiny. And that science itself is parted into two. There's the science that deals with the events and finalities before the occurrence of the hour, and then the other that looks at things that occur after the hour. So eschatology is just one of those. The other is now mainly philosophical, because it deals with being, with you as an existent being, above and beyond just life. Above and beyond just life. You're alive, that's one thing, but now you're existent, right? So it's much more broad, and it's really very few people, I would say, are actually able to venture thought into those fields. Even the sciences themselves don't really do much in terms of, they do help. If you study those sciences, you study philosophy and stuff, they do help in probing inquiry into that, but understanding that is of a much higher intelligence. I mean, even myself, I'm not there yet, so I'm still probing my own inquiry into it. But understanding that requires a much higher level of intelligence, and we'll talk about these levels of intelligence, inshallah. Inshallah. Okay, so I think let's end here, because it's time for Maghrib, and inshallah we'll resume next week. Though if you haven't yet started, I would encourage you to start writing down the text, the Arabic text. I'm delaying it so that you all have enough time to write down the entire text, and so that you can study as we go along, inshallah. So next week, inshallah, maybe I will start next week, inshallah, I want to start with an introduction to Abu Zayd al-Balqi, and we'll look at the first chapter of his book. Well, I'm only going to concentrate on the first chapter, inshallah. The rest is for you to read and study, inshallah. So let's end here. سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته جزاك الله خيرا جزاك الله.
عليكم السلام.
السلام.